Estados Unidos versus Rusia.
United States versus Russia. The United States, the ailing giant, began 2026 with an unprecedented military escalation against everything and everyone. In just 10 days, the United States hijacked 3 new oil tankers, one of them under the Russian flag, carried out a criminal military attack against Venezuela, leaving 100 dead, kidnapped Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, publicly declared that it would soon conquer Greenland, a nation belonging to Denmark, predicted further airstrikes against Nigeria, issued threats of new attacks against Iran, and withdrew from 66 international treaties and organizations.
Tratados y organizaciones internacionales. Todo esto en apenas 10 días.
All this in just 10 days. Russia finally drew a line and responded early yesterday morning by attacking Ukraine with one of its superweapons, the Oryeshnik hypersonic missile, as a show of force against the US advance. The United States, however, will not abandon its imperial course of confrontation against everything and everyone, like a staggering boxer throwing wild punches before his spectacular fall. In this context, we should no longer ask ourselves whether a great global nuclear war will begin, but rather when that terrible final war will start. Good night, good afternoon, and good morning from Berlin, Germany.
Y muy buenos días desde Berlín, Alemania. Comenzamos la transmisión número 290.
We begin broadcast number 293 of Demolishing Myths Live at an unusual time, 2 hours later than usual. Because of a professional commitment, we couldn't start at the regular time and had to delay it by 2 hours. Thank you very much for joining us, of course, and remember to support us with a thumbs up, as well as through memberships, our PayPal account, and for those who wish to, also on Patreon. Welcome everyone. There we share what we can't show on this channel, on this platform. Demolishers, 10 days into the year 2026. You'll remember that before the year began, we predicted a 2026 even more tense, more explosive, and more dangerous than 2025. But honestly, we didn't expect this in just 10 days.
Estados Unidos comenzó.
The United States has begun a new phase of its imperialism, which we describe as blatant imperialism, and that will be the focus of this broadcast. We will present scenarios of US interventions, as well as Chinese, Russian, and Iranian responses, and scenarios of wars, global nuclear wars. Toward the end, if time allows, we can also take questions, since today's broadcast is, in a way, a special one. As we started at a different time than usual, we can naturally take questions at the end as well.
Imperialismo descarado.
Blatant imperialism. A phase of the imperial policy of the United States, which naturally shows continuities with the traditional American imperialism, but at the same time is characterized by specific distinctive features. For example, the fact that extrajudicial killings have become a regular, everyday matter, direct and indirect interventions across the entire planet as a daily routine occurrence as well, and even military interventions on the American continent, something that until recently seemed anachronistic.
Hasta hace poco tiempo anacrónico. Recordarán la última fase de intervención.
You'll remember the last phase of US military interventions in the 1970s, in the 1980s, and from then on, the usual meddling as always, without military actions, at least not on a large scale. This was abandoned. It was abandoned a week ago with the attack on. In this blatant imperialism, the seizure of resources also appears as a new feature. Not because the United States hadn't previously taken part in the struggle for energy, mineral, food, and water resources, naturally all over the world, but because from now on it does so openly, precisely.
De manera descarada, precisamente. Ya no acomete acción.
It no longer undertakes actions to involve its multinational oil companies across the world, nor does it carry out operations to overthrow governments in order to seize oil resources, as in Iraq, for example. Instead, it directly commits the hijacking of oil tankers full of oil, or even without oil, like the Empty Mariner, despite Trump's statements. A captured ship, empty, without oil. And above all, this shameless imperialism, this new phase of US foreign policy, imperial as always, but now with this added quality, this adjective, shameless, the main difference lies precisely in the lack of excuses, in the lack of justifications.
En la falta de justificaciones. Por eso, después de...
That's why, after the criminal attack against Venezuela, after the capture of its president and his wife, about which we'll also be presenting a good amount of exclusive information in just a bit, immediately after that, on the very same day, Trump appeared at the White House simply saying, "From now on, we control Venezuela." Many were shouting around him. The old lifelong neoconservative hawks were shouting around him, "Mr. President, please, the magic word. Mr. President, the magic word." And what is the magic word of the destroyers and grinders? Democracy.
La palabra mágica, demoledores y demoledoras. Democracia. Recuerden que con la excusa de la democracia...
Remember that, under the pretext of democracy, the invasions of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and the attacks against Serbia, against Kosovo were carried out. If we go further back in time, well, we would even find Vietnam, Korea, and many others. But at least during that imperial phase of the United States, we witnessed a legalistic veneer, an institutional veneer, a democratic veneer, since those interventions, those wars, supposedly aimed at establishing democracy, something that in itself runs counter to any logic that makes sense in a democracy imposed through bombings.
En una democracia impuesta a bombazos. Y por cierto, no debo remarchar el hecho de que ninguno de los países...
And, by the way, I shouldn't have to point out that in none of the countries intervened by the United States was democracy established. Not even close. Could we even describe the United States itself as a democracy? Or are we, in fact, witnessing a plutocracy, a society controlled and run by the wealthy, and not just the wealthy, but the billionaires? We could even describe the US political system as a kleptocracy, a government of thieves. But beyond that, and beyond the hypocrisy of these interventions carried out in the name of democracy, what we see today is precisely the complete absence of such justifications.
La ausencia total de justificaciones de este tipo. Por eso muchos vociferaban aquel día.
That's why many, were shouting that day from different opinion circles, like the major US media outlets, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post. Democracy, Mr. President, democracy. And Trump simply replied, No, we don't want democracy. We want the oil. And not only that, but they also want to push China out, not just from Venezuela, but from all of Latin America. And naturally, they also want to intimidate, to frighten the regional powers, above all Brazil, as well as Mexico. The initial explanation, the justification about drug trafficking, about the narco boats, was abandoned shortly afterward, even by them.
Narcolanchas fue abandonada poco después incluso por ellos mismos, ¿sí? Y de hecho, las declaraciones de Trump...
And in fact, Trump's statements, just 24 hours ago, saying that ground military actions against Mexico would now begin as part of the fight against drug trafficking, that justification, that excuse, will also be abandoned very soon, also abandoned within the framework of US objectives across the continent. And this is the difference, the main difference between blatant imperialism and the earlier US imperialism. The masks have fallen. The end of the democratic, institutional veneer of the pursuit of freedom. No. We simply want Venezuela's oil. Just like that.
Así, sin más. Y no solo eso, sino que además...
And not only that, but on that same day, the day of the attack on Venezuela and the capture, or rather the kidnapping, of Nicolás Maduro, he also supported this outrage, because how else can one describe that statement but as an outrage? But he also followed that statement with another along the same lines. We're going to conquer Greenland. Why? Just because. Because we want it for our national security. And that's enough, my friends. Today, in an interview, Trump responded to a question on this topic by saying, "Why the Danes?" And remember that Greenland is one of the constituent nations of the Kingdom of Denmark.
Del Reino de Dinamarca. Dinamarca, parte de la Unión Europea.
Denmark, part of the European Union and also of NATO. meaning that the capture of Greenland would not only generate a conflict with Denmark, but also with the European Union. We'll also be presenting quite a few updates on this shortly when we begin the specific analysis of each of these scenarios. In the meantime, we're focusing on the United States and these 10 days of madness within the framework of this new imperial phase of blatant imperialism. We're going to conquer Greenland just because we want it. And in today's talk, in today's interview, President Donald Trump responded, "Why are the Danes in control of Greenland? Why did they arrive there 500 years ago at the hands of the Vikings? Why does that give them the right to sovereignty over those territories? We want them, and we will conquer those territories." Yet another example, one more example of blatant imperialism. Now then, in the wretched, pitiful, execrable rumor mills of the major Western media outlets, even in the media critical of Trump, they present this US advance, this US offensive, as a demonstration of the power of the United States, of President Trump's own power. In a way, they present it contradictorily. Something like how despotic, how tyrannical this president is against policies in favor of LGBTI rights, in favor of what they describe as woke ideology.
Lo que caracterizan como la ideología woke. Qué malo el presidente, pero a la vez qué presidente fuerte.
How bad the president is, but at the same time, what a strong president, in that hypocrisy and duality of the media of the major US media outlets. And the European and Latin American media simply do a copy-paste of all these positions, of all these narratives. They present almost a replica, without much intervention in the narratives. They present this in the same way. How powerful the United States is, advancing all over the world. How strong President Trump is. But in reality, we are witnessing precisely the opposite. Empires that rely on the use of force are empires in decline. Why?
Imperios en decadencia. ¿Por qué? Porque carecen de los recursos.
Because they lack conventional resources, the most useful, most subtle resources of political power, cultural power, and economic power. The United States has abandoned them all. It no longer has the economic power it enjoyed in the post-war years. It has completely lost the economic power of global production and industry. Only the dollar still remains as its last reserve of financial, though not economic power. And even that is in serious trouble. Politically speaking, no one simply stands with the United States anymore as a more or less serious political ally. Even Trump, in just these 10 days, decided to withdraw from or abandon 66 international treaties and organizations.
66 tratados y organizaciones internacionales. Algunas de lo más básicas.
Some of the most basic ones, right? Not organizations and treaties on debatable issues like gender or, well, environmentalism. No. Withdrawals from treaties on maritime law or matters concerning international communication protocols used worldwide, telephone prefixes, basic things for international governance. Donald Trump abandoned all of this with a single stroke, and that reflects political weakness. As for the cultural side, there's no doubt the United States still holds considerable power, but it's also in decline.
Considerable, pero también en decadencia. Las narrativas críticas y las
critical narratives and critical voices, like ours, and those of all the analysts on this channel, even though we still appear to be in the minority, and all of you demolishers must remember this. You there, as critical thinkers, represent a minority, yes, but one that is clearly growing. We are winning over more and more minds through our arguments. Therefore, not even cultural power, until recently exclusive to the United States, remains in absolute control of that, nor the economy, nor politics, nor culture, and what remains as the last resort. What is the recourse of empires in decline, of powers in decline?
Imperios en decadencia, de los poderes en decadencia. La fuerza, el último de todos los
force, the last of all resources. And that is why the United States acts, why President Trump acts, against that international order created by the United States itself after World War II, in its own image and likeness. Who established the United Nations? Who established the Bretton Woods organizations, including the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and so on? All those organizations, all those treaties, until recently served the interests of the United States. But of course, faced with this decline, the United States abandons them, as proof, once again, and I emphasize it, of the weakness of the United States.
De debilidad de Estados Unidos. Y en este contexto de...
And in this context of a declining empire, increasingly violent, but once again not more violent because it is more powerful, but more violent because it is weaker, we are also witnessing total disorder, total and absolute chaos. US policies no longer respond to strategic planning, no longer respond to a grounded, systematized, well-thought-out perspective, but rather US policies respond to impulses, spasms, explosions, and with President Donald Trump, even more so. Marco Rubio over here, we have to invade Venezuela. We have to invade Venezuela. And Trump, at a certain point, decides to begin an attack on Venezuela. Over here, Netanyahu, we have to attack Iran. We have to attack Iran. And Trump, at some point, begins an attack on Iran. We have to conquer Greenland. Trump regurgitates the need to seize Greenland. Mexico, the drugs, the drug cartels.
México, las drogas, los cárteles de drogas. Como si el problema de las adicciones en Estados Unidos.
As if the problem of addiction in the United States was simply a result of drug trafficking from Mexico or Canada, another major drug supplier. Why does the United States have an addiction problem, unlike any other country in the world? Some Americans might answer, because we have a lot of money and can buy drugs. Well, European countries also have, or at least until recently had, a high level of purchasing power. And while drugs are indeed available in Europe, European countries do not face a massive addiction crisis like the United States, with people on the streets like zombies, completely ruined, hundreds of thousands dying every year. Why only in the United States, if drugs circulate all over the world? Why?
¿Por qué? Porque Estados Unidos, a diferencia del resto del mundo,
because the United States, unlike the rest of the world, has a demand for narcotics, a population thirsty for drugs like nowhere else on Earth. And why demolishes? Because American society appears broken. Broken economically by the lack of opportunities, the lack of jobs, miserable wages, inhuman levels of exploitation. Broken by hyper-individualism, which is directly tied to the economic system driven by the United States. Neoliberal, financial, and digital capitalism, which brings about the destruction of all possible forms of community in which a person can take part, both political ones, such as political parties, labor unions, and social movements, and also community forms perhaps linked to conservative thought. The church, the family.
La familia, todo eso aparece.
All of that appears broken in the United States, and increasingly so around the world. And that's why there's such an urgent need for drugs, for an escape from a reality that's unbearable, unlivable, intolerable for so many people. That's the real drug problem in the United States, not the arrival of drugs through Mexico. By the way, with Mexican cartels laundering their enormous profits on Wall Street and the DEA, the most important US organization supposedly dedicated to fighting drug trafficking, acting as the main administrator of the drug trade in the United States. So, US politics and the US economy are also involved in the drug business.
También participan en el negocio de las drogas, mucho más que los
much more than the Mexican, Colombian, or any other drug lords. But beyond that, the problem doesn't lie in supply. The problem lies in demand, in a broken society. This is the disorder within the United States. No strategic planning, a society on the brink of civil war, an economy in decline. And so, in this context of chaos, an increasing authoritarianism in an armed society. And remember all the images of people recently killed, whether by ICE, that para-state police force created for deporting people, the border police, or the paramilitary police of another organization. All of them, armed, shooting, in an ever-growing spiral of violence.
A los tiros en una espiral creciente de violencia.
And in this context, the United States, once again, does not act from power, not from strength, but from weakness, from imperial decline. In this context, the United States makes increasingly serious strategic mistakes. It pursues fickle policies. Venezuela, attack on Iran, attack on Venezuela, attempt to conquer Greenland, attacks on Somalia, the first attack carried out by Trump since the beginning of last year, attacks on Nigeria, as before, attacks on Syria. After they installed a headcutter in the Syrian government, you will recall the overthrow of Assad and how they installed al-Golani, a headcutter, and suddenly, ISIS militants carried out an attack against US troops there, and then the United States began its attacks on Syria.
Y comenzaron entonces los ataques de Estados Unidos contra Siria, también. Ataques contra Yemen.
Also attacks against Yemen. What courage the Yemenis have, huh? Pay attention to the courage and consistency of the Yemenis. They rejected the genocide in that unmentionable country due to censorship and responded accordingly, even against the United States, with 2 aircraft carrier groups stationed off their coasts, bombing Yemen. And yet the Americans had to retreat from Yemen with their tails between their legs. Trump presented it as a victory. We punished them severely. Lies, lies. Yes, they carried out some brutal massacres, but the Yemenis did not back down. Millions of people in the streets. The United States had to retreat.
Debió retroceder Estados Unidos, pero bueno, uno de los tantos.
Anyway, this is just one of many American initiatives driven by a fickle policy. Well, Yemen. Boom, everyone over there. Oh no, they're hitting us. Almost 2 F-16s lost. Almost, according to US media. According to other sources, the F-16s were lost. And a ship almost sunk, according to other sources, by some very crude Yemeni drones. They had to pull back. In Nigeria, attacks against the groups that attack Christians. Another Trump invention. Nothing. In Syria, a civil war is about to begin, despite US strikes. In Venezuela. What did they achieve in Venezuela? Maduro's removal? And anything more than that?
Generaron en Venezuela la salida de Maduro y más que eso. Errores estratégicos por doquier.
Strategic mistakes everywhere. Lack of planning, chaos, disorder, weakness. This is the situation of the United States, seen from critical geopolitics. If you want a different view from that of the Superman and Trump dressed as a cowboy saying, "We decide what we want." Today I answered that disgraceful Trump, a question from his equally disgraceful journalists. Mr. President Trump, would you carry out the kidnapping of President Vladimir Putin, as you did with President Maduro? What a bootlicking question. And what did the other disgraceful one reply? Oh, I don't think that would be necessary. I have a good relationship, but I could, yes, kidnap him at any time. What kidnapping, seriously? Putin. With a flick of Putin's finger, the United States would disappear.
Desaparece Estados Unidos. Recuérdenlo, no solo Estados Unidos desaparece Estados Unidos.
Remember this, it's not just the United States that disappears. Russia disappears too, and life on Earth disappears. But bragging about things like, oh, just like I kidnapped Maduro, I could kidnap Putin. How stupid. How stupid. What a leech. Anyway, this is the general situation of the United States. This blatant imperialism within the framework of undeniable imperial decline, of growing weakness. And so, scenarios of confrontation arise against the great powers, and also against intermediate powers. The first scenario, logically, is Venezuela. The first scenario, without a doubt, is Venezuela, where once again the major media immediately presented first the excellent news of the fall of a dictator, and how wonderful the restoration of democracy. In that regard, by the way, I must make a comment about the disgraceful coverage of what happened on Deutsche Welle. Truly disgraceful, shameful, disgusting. How revolting, honestly. Journalists celebrating, now living in Germany, yes, but of Latin American or Spanish origin, celebrating the attack against the brotherly people of Venezuela. 100 dead at the hands of the gringos, the historical enemies of our peoples, celebrating that in the name of so-called democracy. What democracy, you idiots? Besides being immoral, idiots, disgraceful. And by the way, I'm not going to make it personal, but I'm overcome with fury and I'm going to start naming names. But my goodness, the names involved in Deutsche Welle. My dear, how outrageous.
Mamita querida, qué pasados, qué historias de vida. Y si no
What life stories? And if not, take a look at the biographies of the journalists at Deutsche Welle in Spanish. You'll find surprises, lots of surprises. Back then, the media presented this first as a victory for democracy. Well, shortly after, Trump responded to all of them. Maria Corina, what? No, they don't even respect her in Venezuela. Well, for the first time, Trump said something true. The other day she reappeared, looking more and more like the Joker, her mouth huge, full of Botox, her cheekbones lifted, saying, "Oh, I'm going to give my Nobel Prize to Donald Trump. How great that they bombed Venezuela, my country. What a scoundrel." Well, that was the scenario. They launched an attack without much strategic planning. Yes, of course, with troop concentration, with a military intervention efficiently carried out to kidnap Maduro. But what did they achieve? The removal of Maduro and the fall of the regime as they wanted? No. Protests in the streets by outraged Venezuelans, seizing power and determining the capture and execution, the public burning of all the top Chavista leadership. No. On the contrary, people were in the streets supporting the government. Maduro did not leave office. The vice president took over. The armed forces responded with loyalty. On that note, you'll remember that we presented 3 hypotheses here about what happened beyond the strategic mistake made by the United States. That, without question, is the context. But we presented 3 hypotheses about what happened internally. Why Maduro's capture was so easy, without a military response beyond those 100 deaths. And 3 options emerged: betrayal, an agreement, or a strategic mistake by the United States, involving a special forces intervention that was militarily effective, but waiting for a series of consequences that never materialized. And more evidence is appearing to support the latter, which we presented as our preferred hypothesis. An operation carried out by surprise, because the Venezuelans made the mistake of being overly confident. They won't make that mistake again.
Una confianza excesiva, no van a cometer este error. Mucha gente, evidentemente,
a lot of people were clearly involved from foreign intelligence services, and not just the CIA, but probably the usual suspects, MI6, Mossad, and so on. But apparently, we wouldn't have witnessed a situation of major betrayals within Chavismo or the armed forces. They would have carried out this intervention successfully. Those in charge of Venezuela's defense, those responsible for Maduro's protection, responded poorly. And it could even seem, yes, somewhat like that second hypothesis, the one about an agreement, with Maduro leaving the government as a kind of concession on his part, in exchange for an attack like the one we saw the other day, rather than a massive assault with bombings everywhere.
Un ataque masivo con bombardeos por doquier. Sí, esa también otra de las posibilidades con cada.
That's also another one of the possibilities, with more and more signs pointing to it. So of the 3, the betrayal scenario is becoming less likely, while an effective US military intervention is becoming more likely, a poor military response from Venezuela, but a strategic mistake by the United States in terms of the consequences, and the possibility of an agreement by Maduro to step down in exchange for not starting an open war that would destroy all of Venezuela. Those are now the hypotheses with the strongest indications of probability. In any case, under any of those 3 hypotheses, the United States made a mistake. Why? Because with this attack, it wanted the fall of the entire regime, and that didn't happen at all. And now it's beginning, in an improvised way, to make agreements with the current government so that, and apparently not, this, as suggested both by Donald Trump and by the oil executives invited to the White House yesterday, as well as by a statement from PDVSA itself. Apparently, they're going to reactivate trade in Venezuelan oil, exporting it to the United States as before, sold at the international price.
Exportándolo a Estados Unidos, como antes, vendido al precio internacional. Con lo cual, vamos a retroceder.
Which means we're going to go back to the situation before the sanctions began, when with Chavez still alive, even up until around 2013, about a year after his death, Venezuela was exporting most of its heavy oil to the United States, until the US decided to start a policy of economic destruction against Venezuela through severe sanctions. That led to the almost complete withdrawal of US oil companies, with the small exception of Chevron, and the arrival of oil companies, above all Chinese ones, a few Russian ones too, but mostly Chinese.
Un poquito rusas también, pero por sobre todo las cosas chinas. Con lo cual, después de todos estos años, más de 10 años.
So then, after all these years, more than 10 years of sanctions, an attack that left 100 dead, the kidnapping of the president, we're going to go back to the current situation. Sorry, to the situation before all this, to the way things had always been in Venezuela, even under Chavez. Because Chavez did have a very coherent, very dignified anti-imperialist discourse, with many measures aimed at Latin American unity, autonomy and sovereignty, but he sold Venezuelan oil to the United States for Venezuela's benefit, because that generated good, hefty income for the country, also for the United States. So, what's the problem? A win-win agreement. We're going to go back to that.
Un acuerdo ganar-ganar. Vamos a retroceder hacia eso. Para eso, entonces, el ataque. ¿Cuál el sentido?
That's why, then, the attack. What's the point? What's the point of that attack if in the end they create the same situation they started with? A situation of negotiation and economic ties proposed by Venezuela throughout all these years. Venezuela never rejected, especially not in recent years, the possibility of reactivating oil trade with the United States. And for Venezuela, that's a good thing. Strategic mistake. Strategic mistake in Venezuela. And by the way, another thing that's been heard around, devastating comments from both men and women. The comments keep coming up. We'll present them all at the end. Devastating ones, because I don't want to lose the thread of the argument until the end.
No quiero abandonar el hilo de la argumentación hasta el final y después comenzamos con los comentarios, las preguntas, lo que ustedes quieran.
And then we'll move on to comments, questions, whatever you'd like. By the way, there are also rumors about Venezuela, signs suggesting that not only did the US military allegedly want to capture Maduro and carry out a diversionary operation attacking various military sites, especially in and around Caracas, but there are also indications that the US military forces may have sought to seize La Carlota Airport, located there in Caracas. Remember it from my time living in Venezuela, staying at a hotel with rooms facing that airport. By the way, a military airport located right there in Caracas.
Un aeropuerto militar ubicado ahí en Caracas. Zona muy bonita, por cierto. Habrían querido.
A very beautiful area, by the way. They would have wanted to capture that airport as the landing point for a much larger arrival of US planes. But they couldn't. Apparently, militarily they couldn't. And that's why a military operation was planned, not as an amphibious invasion, but rather as a much larger airborne landing. And from there, the capture of both the government and all of Caracas, as well as other key decision-making points in Venezuelan territory. Well, it turned out to be a failure. It collided with the Venezuelan military resistance, which in that case was successful.
Con la resistencia militar venezolana, ahí sí exitosa, representó un fracaso absoluto y por eso
it represented an absolute failure, and that's why they had to backtrack and readjust the narrative of, we're going to carry out a military attack against Venezuela, we're going to bring down the Chavista regime and establish a government aligned with the interests of the United States and the Venezuelan people. They readjusted that. That was Trump's narrative up until the day of the attack. Oh no. Actually, we only wanted Maduro, and now we're going to establish good relations with Delcy Rodriguez. Wow, what a change. Overnight. Well, maybe because they couldn't actually do that. And as a key element for this interpretation, let's remember the concentration of approximately 1/3 of US military power in Caribbean waters.
Un tercio del poderío militar estadounidense en aguas del Caribe. Una cantidad de tropas acumulada ahí tremenda.
A huge number of troops gathered there. Tremendous. Plus, an aircraft carrier with its strike group. Planes, but also troops. What for? Why so many troops there, if later they carried out a special operation, some attacks here and there, distractions, and a special operation against Maduro? Why so many troops? Maybe because they actually wanted to capture the La Carlota military airport in Caracas. And from there, yes, have Hercules planes loaded with Marines, loaded with US Armed Forces personnel, land en masse at that airport, and from there begin a massive military operation. It could perhaps be described as an invasion without an amphibious landing. Difficult, but something like that.
Embarco anfibio difícil, pero algo parecido. Y no pudieron y rectificaron entonces la narrativa, reacomodaron y comenzaron.
And they couldn't. So they corrected the narrative. They rearranged things and started saying, oh well, actually this is a message for the rest of the Chavista leaders, and now we're going to establish relations with Delcy Rodriguez. So then, what was all that for? A strategic mistake, once again, devastating. In any case, this Venezuelan scenario doesn't present the same destructive potential for the world that the Iranian scenario does. I'm not, in any way, downplaying the importance of Venezuela for the Americas, of the Venezuelan geopolitical situation for all of Latin America, for the Venezuelan people. No, not at all.
Venezolano para toda América Latina, para el pueblo venezolano, no. Importantísimo, los 100 muertos verdaderamente.
Extremely important. The 100 dead are truly a terrible stain on Venezuela's history. We will all remember this infamous attack for the rest of our lives. But this does not present a destabilizing potential for the world, nor the possibility of a nuclear escalation, as the Iranian scenario does. The Iranian scenario, by the way, where in recent days we have witnessed insurrectional demonstrations in different parts of the city. How curious. Just a few days after Netanyahu's visit to the United States, following several statements by both Netanyahu and Trump about the uprisings. Suddenly, uprisings begin, obviously encouraged by all the organizations dedicated to promoting the opposition in Iran. Obviously, many people appear discontented. But who is driving this?
Descontenta, pero quien motoriza esto, quien acicatea los puntos específicos para
Who stirs up the specific points to make that mass react? Foreign intelligence services, as always. As always, the famous color revolutions, and so on. Terrible images seen out there. Protesters burning mosques, burning. We can take a quick look at the map, because otherwise it all gets a bit heavy with me talking for so long without any images. We can, for example, take a quick look at Iran over here. There must surely be some footage.
Irán, por aquí, seguramente alguna imagen. Protestas, saqueos.
Protests, looting? Well, no, not massive looting, but yes, destruction of mosques and so on. Many in this city, by the way, in Kermanshah. Today, some of these mass demonstrations have undoubtedly already resulted in 6 deaths. The situation is much calmer now. Many of these protests have been pacified, and few people are taking part. In any case, the media present it as the end of the world, or rather, the end of the Iranian regime.
Como el fin del mundo, o el fin más bien del régimen iraní. Este escenario.
This scenario presents an initial objective, overthrow. They won't be able to. The protesters have already begun to retreat. They won't be able, with this forced insurrection, to bring about the overthrow of the regime. But they are indeed setting the stage for a later attack. Very soon an attack will begin. Israel will start it, logically. And this attack and Iran's response carry an enormous potential for escalation. Enormous. Not just regional anymore, but even global. Why? Because a sequence of events very similar to what happened in the so-called 12-day war is about to begin.
Muy parecida a la sucedida en la llamada Guerra de 12 días. Israel va a comenzar con un ataque sorpresivo,
Israel is going to launch a surprise attack, surely involving many infiltrated paid operatives, just like last time. Many paid Afghans, very poor people, paid a pittance to carry out insurrectional acts during the initial attacks. That happened last time. In fact, that's how they were initially able to disable the anti-air defense system. They also carried out drone attacks, something very similar to Operation Spider, conducted by Ukraine against US strategic bombers, evidently also prepared with Mossad's involvement. But when the Iranians reacted after the initial surprise, once again everyone was surprised. The Iranians were surprised. The Venezuelans were surprised. Such naivety sometimes, such naivety. Surprised, of course, partly because that very day they had begun negotiations, the 6th round of negotiations. So, what kind of country, what kind of power starts negotiations for disarmament, for an agreement on nuclear development? After having created it, and after the United States abandoned it, they begin negotiations in a context of de-escalation. And that very same day, the Israelis strike. Well, a plain and simple betrayal, a treacherous one. But such naivety all the same. Such naivety, because you can never deal with these people. You just can't. Even when you tell the truth, these people lie. Back then, the Israelis started with this surprise. The assassination of several members of the Iranian officer corps, some political officials, several nuclear engineers, and their families too. All of them sleeping in their homes. Boom! Bombs, missiles against their houses. Those officers dead, those political officials, those engineers, their wives, their children, the neighbors, everyone, as always. But after that, the Iranians reactivated their defenses and began to respond. And they responded with much more power than Israel had anticipated. Something that's been said here on this channel time and time again. Beware of Iran's missile arsenal. And beware of the fallacies about Israel's supposedly impenetrable air defenses. The dome, the Iron Dome, as it's called in English, the Iron Dome. No, they don't actually call it Iron Dome. The translation is different, something like Iron Dome or Iron Shield. Then there's the second layer of missile defenses. David's Sling, the David's Wave, the Iron Dome. I can never remember the word dome, thanks to the demolishers for that. Iron Dome, David's Wave, the famous American THAAD interceptors, capable of interception outside the atmosphere. Well, despite all that narrative, all those stories, the Iranian missiles began to fall one after another, along with the drones, first swarms of drones, then missiles. And by the second or third day, the government imposed a total ban on publishing images in the media, absolute censorship. Because in those first days, the attacks kept coming one after another. Here, there, Tel Aviv. Hit time and again. From that feeling of impunity, of a kind of omnipotence, the Iranians will never be able to strike our territory with their missiles. Well, they did. And they managed to hit military bases, military research institutes, total destruction, intelligence centers. And we were able to determine that despite the censorship during those days,
lo pudimos determinar a pesar de la censura en esos días. Y con el correr de los días, una vez terminada la guerra de los 12 días,
and as the days went by, once the 12-day war was over, the media began to show images of the destruction. Days later, what they called 13 major destroyed targets had become more than 20. And they weren't destroyed with small missiles, but with ballistic missiles weighing several tons. Large, intermediate-range missiles. That's why, faced with this Iranian military power, the Israelis had to call on the United States to intervene, because they seemed increasingly cornered, increasingly trapped. And that's when Trump decided on those attacks, really more coordinated than anything else, with the famous bunker buster bombs meant to destroy nuclear arsenals. Well, they didn't actually destroy anything, it was all a lie, but at least they delivered a strong blow and led to an agreement with Iran to pause the war for the time being. Why?
De pausa de esta guerra por el momento. ¿Por qué? Porque Israel ya no podía más.
because Israel couldn't take it anymore. And when the new war in Iran begins, we're going to witness a very similar sequence. Israeli attacks, surely with some treacherous surprise, but the Iranians will respond sooner or later with even greater weapons, with all the arsenal that hasn't been used yet, still intact in those underground bunkers, despite the American bombs. And by the way, Iran will show a much greater defensive capability. And even if they call on the United States, we'll find ourselves in an uncertain scenario. Uncertain because this time, the United States won't be able to carry out a showy attack like those bombs with the B-2 bombers and so on. Remember that? Trump saying, "Our super pilots dropped the bombs. We destroyed everything."
Destruimos todo. Bueno, al final, a los pocos días, según los propios medios estadounidenses.
Well, in the end, after a few days, according to the US media themselves, American intelligence didn't destroy anything. Not the nuclear arsenal, not the missile arsenal, nothing. Just a soap opera for the media in the first few days, and nothing more. And in this second war, we're going to see the same sequence. An Israeli attack, an Iranian response much stronger than last time, and when the Israelis are caught between a rock and a hard place, they'll call the United States. But the Americans won't be able to launch another fake attack, only a more or less negotiated exit with Iran.
Y una salida más o menos acordada con Irán. No. Comenzará entonces.
No. Then a strong escalation will begin, and Iran will respond with more attacks against Israel. And that could even create a much more critical situation in Israel than last time. Russia, moreover, and China are now participating much more actively in this conflict, because they are aware that after Iran, they are next, and they are now indeed sending many more S-400 defense systems, and they are also training Iranian soldiers in how to use them.
A los militares iraníes para su utilización. Y puede que no vayan a convalidar.
And it may be that the Russians and the Chinese won't endorse an attack, whether by the United States, much stronger than those for the public attacks, what in Argentina we'd call for the fans. Those attacks staged like a soap opera, like a narrative to exit the conflict. And it may even be that Israel, cornered between a rock and a hard place, decides, led by a retinue of messianic genocidal maniacs, completely deranged supremacists, murderers, that at that moment they'll decide to use their nuclear arsenal and, trapped as they are, begin nuclear attacks. And then, ladies and gentlemen, we will witness an unpredictable scenario. Something begins that has never been seen before, beyond Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when Japan had no capacity to respond. Japan already surrendered. And, well, something completely different. Besides, how many years ago was that? 70 years ago.
70 años atrás. ¿Convalidará en ese caso Rusia un ataque de estas características?
Would Russia, in that case, condone an attack of this nature and beyond? China? India? Pakistan? The rest of the Arab countries? Or could this trigger a nuclear escalation involving China, India, and the United States? Iranian attacks on Israel's nuclear facilities.
Ataques de Irán contra las instalaciones nucleares de Israel. Yo no lo puedo determinar, no lo puede determinar nadie porque aún no comenzó.
I can't determine that. No one can, because it hasn't started yet. But that's the scenario being presented. That's the scenario being presented. That's why this scenario, Linani, presents a destructive, disruptive potential on a global scale. Not like Venezuela's situation for the American continent. Very important, yes, but without the potential for nuclear escalation. Iran's, yes. He will say yes. This is the situation. That's my forward-looking analysis. In Ukraine, we will soon witness greater Russian advances, up to the capture of half of Ukraine, Ukraine's surrender.
La rendición de Ucrania. Y presumiblemente después de esto, como presenta.
And presumably, after this, as Karaganov presents, and by the way, whoever can, don't miss our channel on Patreon, where Fernando Moragon and I, yours truly, analyze the interview given by Sergei Karaganov, the quintessential Russian geostrategist, regarding Russia's nuclear threshold, and precisely the possibility of a direct war between Russia and Europe, not with the United States, after the resolution of the war in Ukraine. Ukraine will capitulate, but it's very likely that the Europeans won't back down, won't establish the necessary security agreements with Russia, and will want before long to strike again. And that's when a direct war between Europe and Russia will begin.
Ucrania. Perdón, entre Europa y Rusia, mil disculpas, ¿sí?
But even that scenario, looking ahead with much more time on the horizon, still doesn't present the immediate destructive potential or nuclear escalation risk of the Iranian scenario. That's why my forward-looking analysis places the focus of possible escalation in the war, in the next war in Iran. That's where the pieces fall into place for an unpredictable situation. Later on, yes, of course, we can recall the Greenland scenario, but there we'll witness an immediate surrender of Greenland and the European Union.
Una rendición inmediata de Groenlandia y de la Unión Europea. Cuidado, esto sí podría generar.
Careful, this could indeed lead to, and this is interesting, careful, because this could indeed lead to, or should lead to, that scenario, the immediate and definitive breakup of NATO, and perhaps even the breakup of the European Union as well. And this, and here again we see the strategic mistakes of the United States, would create for the US a much worse immediate security situation than the current one. Yes, it's true. Europeans lack significant armed forces and make only a very minor contribution to NATO's collective defense. But the existence of this alliance and of Article 5 in some way creates a certain unity, at least for now, in form, regarding the European continent.
Respecto al continente europeo. Una vez rota.
Once NATO is broken, after an eventual confrontation, perhaps not a military one, but simply a decision by Trump, the deployment of troops in Greenland, bases in Greenland, maybe even its purchase, Denmark's protests, some diplomatic or political skirmish, maybe a small military incident, a little spark here and there, perhaps. But yes, the destruction of NATO. And then Europe seems at the mercy either of Russia or of whoever wants to destroy it, even conquer it from within Europe itself, because it's very likely that quarrels will begin among the European countries themselves. And this leads to a decline in US security, both in its relative power and in its strategic safety. That's why it's yet another strategic mistake. One more. Anyway, these are the scenarios then: Venezuela, Iran, Ukraine, and Greenland. I'm not deliberately including Taiwan, because for the United States to start something in Taiwan, one of these previous scenarios would have to appear resolved. And they won't appear resolved before the end of the year. They won't appear resolved. And China will delay a confrontation with the United States over Taiwan as long as possible. Why? Because the more time passes, the more powerful China will become, and the less powerful the United States will be. So the more they delay this, the better for the Chinese. That's why, for now, I'd put the Taiwan issue on pause, on ice, in the freezer, waiting for the resolution of these other, much closer scenarios. That said, Demolidors and Demolidoras, I'll start answering questions from now on, and of course we already have 2 comments from Tonyon L9028. Hello, a long question in 2 comments. Is there agreement among analysts that the world's changes are accelerating? Now an escalation of resource crises, world wars, the USA, the United States, is going crazy. And here's the second part. Until recently, until a few decades ago, there was still some corresponding capacity among peoples to confront abusive regimes, the October Workers' Revolutions, Sierra Maestra, and so on. And the third part of Tonio's question, but in the current technocracy, the difference in power seems absolute. Satellite control, drones, cyber control, mass stupefaction. What means of defense or resistance are left to ordinary people and to the countries of the global south? Quite a question, Tonio. A very good one, but a tough one. In line with your previous analysis, Tonio. Beyond our sympathies or antipathies toward the political movements from which the last 2 great world wars began, the First World War with imperialist nationalisms and colonialism, and the Second World War with the global confrontation between communism, Nazism, and, in quotes, liberalism, the Western imperialist countries.
Imperialistas occidentales. In
all these confrontations, and even later, during the Cold War as well, with the confrontation between, call it whatever you like, the United States, the Soviet Union, the free world against the evil communists, or from the other side, capitalist oppression against the workers' revolution. Call it whatever you like, but those two great blocs were in conflict. And in the First and Second World Wars, behind all those political and ideological blocs, there were convinced people, mobilized people. Well, not today. Not today. In the context of the destruction of all social bonds, of all communal forms of human life, states, nations, labor unions, political parties, the family, the church, all destroyed, beyond hyper-individualism, no one stands with anything anymore.
Entonces, nadie acompaña nada. O todo el mundo acompaña la última moda impuesta.
Either everyone follows the latest trend imposed on social media, but without any will to persevere or to dedicate their life to defending something. Everyone simply reacts to the immediate impulse of gratification, to the format of a TikTok or Instagram post, right? So then, who is going to take part in these wars? A stupefied population, yes, but also a passive one, stripped of ideology in terms of grand narratives, inattentive, misinformed, stupefied, insignificant. So then, who is going to take part in this? That's one of the big questions.
¿Quién va a participar en esto? Hay una de las grandes dudas. Y curiosamente, irónicamente,
and curiously, ironically, that's where one of the weaknesses of the European Union's war project appears, regarding this idea of wanting a war with Russia. Well, will they be able to mobilize societies? Will they be able to mobilize young people for this? For now, no. Everyone rejects it, mainly out of disinterest, out of individualism, not out of a militant commitment to peace or humanism. No, everyone is in their own fantasy world, with a fictitious reality of screens, with content increasingly created in a personalized way, tailored for each person, and even more so with artificial intelligence. Everyone in that fantasy world, in that virtual reality, but at the same time without any possibility of mobilization. And that's one of the great contradictions. Now, the other part of the question, how can we react? How can we respond? Those of us who want peace, the peoples of the global south.
¿Cómo podemos responder quienes queremos la paz, los pueblos del sur? Carecemos de una única respuesta,
We lack a single answer. We lack a crystal ball. But without a doubt this, critical analysis, reflection, interaction, taking part in all these things, with friends, partners, children, parents, dialogue, discussion. From this perspective, all of this helps, because it wakes us up. It wakes us up. It at least generates a critical outlook, so that they can't trample us, crush us, and on top of that, present it as paradise on earth. Let's start reacting. And to react, as a step prior to action, reflection must naturally appear as well, being able to be aware. Well, here we must react. In what direction do we react? Then, naturally, everyone can take part wherever they wish, whether that's a political movement, a neighborhood organization, a charitable action, whatever they want. Everything helps. Everything helps in rejecting war. I'll answer a couple more little questions, several more over here. By the way, just a reminder, we were pleasantly surprised by the response to our channel, which we launched only 10 days ago. By the way, our Patreon channel, where once again we share what we can't show on this platform, what we can't show here, we share there because of censorship, persecution, and so on. First, our initial reaction with Fernando, an analysis of the previously mentioned interview with Karaganov. And the second from a few days ago is an analysis of a spectacular debate among four of the greatest experts on Zionism. The phases of Zionism, the rise of Zionism, the metamorphoses of Zionism, the terminal phase of Zionism.
La fase terminal del sionismo. La relación entre sionismo,
the relationship between Zionism, Judaism, Catholic Zionism, Zionism and Messianism. Well, really, we're learning too. Fernando there with some tremendous analyses. And me here accidentally sharing the wrong tab. Oh, where would this show up? Somewhere around here. What a thing, this platform. Okay, now this one. I was showing anything on the screen. I was showing... Well, actually, Demolishing Myths shows up here again in English. What a thing. This platform showing one thing and presenting another. Let's see now, Demolishers, if I can finally show the Patreon page. At last, at last. Well, this here, what a thing. This platform, what a mess. Anyway, this Patreon already has more than 800 subscribers in 10 days, so don't miss out. Whoever can, once again, join us there. Exclusive and special content, and about things we can't talk about here on YouTube. Last few questions. Here we have Pototo65 from Argentina, dear one. Why isn't it considered that allied or third countries could provide nuclear weapons to Iran? It's not only possible to obtain them through domestic production. What's your take on that? Big hug.
Por producción propia. ¿Qué reflexión me decís? Gran abrazo.
Regarding nuclear weapons, generally speaking, with few exceptions, countries always want to have their own nuclear weapons, to produce them independently. Why? Because only in that way can they determine their use according to their own interests, according to national interest. Otherwise, as in the case of the United Kingdom possesses nuclear weapons, but it cannot carry out attacks without US codes. It cannot launch attacks either with its aging submarines or with its Minuteman missiles. Remember that in the last test of a Minuteman launched from an American, British submarine, it was a test without a nuclear warhead, obviously. Almost. With the defense minister at the time, I can't recall his last name, because lately, with so many prime ministers changing in the United Kingdom, there have also been many defense ministers, a new one every 6 months. If I'm not mistaken, his last name was something like Chad. They wanted to carry out a show of force, an exercise involving the launch of a nuclear-capable Minuteman from one of these submarines, and the missile, due to its age and lack of maintenance, dropped to 50 meters, almost right on top of the submarine itself. And that really could have sunk the submarine, one of those 12-meter-long missiles, more like a rocket than a missile. It almost fell right on top of the submarine itself and would have sunk the submarine, the crew, and the UK's Minister of Defence. This was the last act of pathetic behaviour by the United Kingdom. But beyond that, the UK couldn't carry out a nuclear strike without US codes. So, that's why, generally, countries want to develop their own nuclear weapons and their own nuclear delivery systems. Basically, the means of deployment. Strategic bombers by air, intercontinental missiles, land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, and strategic submarines at sea, the maritime launches. Well, we can also recall the Cuban Missile Crisis with Russian-Soviet missiles placed there. Or we can also remember the presence of US strategic missiles in Italy, in Turkey, if I'm not mistaken, also here in Germany, and, well, naturally in the United Kingdom as well. And, if I'm not mistaken, in the Netherlands. But again, those weren't nuclear missiles from Germany, the Netherlands, Turkey, or Italy, but from the United States. That's why, eventually, if Italy, in a hypothetical example, wanted its own nuclear weapons, Italy would have to produce them and develop its own nuclear weapons, like France. Beyond, well, the technical difficulties. In France's case, if they wanted to carry out a nuclear strike against Russia, they could do so either from their fighter bombers or from their submarines, with many difficulties, but ultimately the decision would be made by the French. Because in that case, they would indeed be their own nuclear weapons. And that's where the need for nuclear production comes from, both for Iran and for any other country interested in nuclear weapons. And if not, just remember the case of North Korea. Why is it that no one, beyond the media's constant bashing of North Korea, starts an attack or an invasion against the so-called villains of the North Korean regime? Because there's Kim Jong-un with his own little missiles, his very own. And when he wants to, he presses the little button and fires them. That's mostly the reason, Potato. Thanks a lot for your input.
Esa es la razón, mayormente. Pototo, muchas gracias por el aporte. Por aquí, Francisco Marco.
Over here, Francisco Marco, free Palestine from the river to the sea. 1,000 thanks, Francisco. We naturally join your battle cry. Over here, Balazo Militar. Hi, Ezekiel. There's a map of the world divided into 3 great empires, the United States, Russia, and China. Could this mean a division of the world before 2030? Balazo, I reject the idea of a Shalta 3.0. This notion of a world divided into 3 parts began as a strategic analysis by US military intelligence services with that idea. Later, in the Spanish-speaking world of geopolitics, Halif often presents it as the tripolar world. I reject the idea of a tripolar world because, for such a world to exist, the United States would have to validate the existence of 2 other untouchable poles.
Debería convalidar la existencia de otros 2 polos no tocables. Esa es la idea de este mundo tripolar, ¿no? Estados Unidos con el continente.
That's the idea behind this tripolar world. The United States with the American continent, the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, then Russia with another part, Eurasia, and China with its share of the Asia-Pacific. Well, the United States doesn't want that. The current imperial madness of the United States, its blatant imperialism, stems from its pursuit of permanence, of maintaining its global control over everything. It doesn't want Russia controlling its sphere of influence, or China controlling its own, much less Iran as a regional power, or North Korea, or even the American countries that are subordinate but somewhat independent. No, it wants absolute control over everything. It wants the continuation of a unipolar world, and so far, it seems willing to sacrifice the United States itself and all of humanity for that goal.
El sacrificio de Estados Unidos y de toda la humanidad en este sentido. Por eso yo rechazo la idea.
That's why I reject the idea of a world divided like in a Shalta 3.0, and those are my arguments. Thank you very much, Golazo Militar. And over here, Jose Santiago, Doctor, today I see you looking down. We value your work, seriously. Downcast, maybe a bit tired, dear Jose Santiago. These last 10 days, so much work, exhausting for everyone. That's why I'm also a little tired. Besides, I had an event right before this, which is why we couldn't start at 9. But anyway, thank you very much. Always grateful for the appreciation, and I'm aware that you're with us. You're with me, with Fernando Moragon, with Juan Antonio Aguilar, with the whole Demoliendo Mitos team, and until recently, even with the DMP analysts. You're there with great spirit, and that's our energy and motivation to keep this going, despite all the consequences. If we look back at the consequences, both for me, professionally and personally, right? You'll remember the censorship at Deutsche Welle, the expulsion from the academy. Well, Fernando faced a complaint at the time, a complaint filed, incredibly, by Ukraine. The Ukrainian authorities filing complaints in the Spanish courts. Fernando was even listed on Mirovets, that Ukrainian list, that was initially described as a list for the assassination of the people included there, a list of Ukrainians' enemies of the Ukrainian homeland. Fernando was included there. Juan Antonio was also persecuted through that, all of us suffering the consequences of our critical and anti-hegemonic discourse. But since you're there with us, and we're convinced of the value of our work, we're not going to give in. We keep going and keep going. That's why we're also creating, outside of this platform, with censorship, but for now still able to do our work, although for how much longer? Honestly, we can't say. So maybe tomorrow all of this will be shut down, not just for us, but for many other critical voices. That's why we're setting up our channel on Patreon as an alternative path, right? That's the idea.
Andrés 15771, Ezequiel, cuidado con
Andres,
Pedro Baños.
15771. Ezequiel, be careful with Pedro Baños. Well, about that, I made a clarification the other day. We take part in media outlets with different political, economic, and ideological leanings, and we always present our position. In fact, back when Western media still invited me, I presented the same position, the same analysis on Telesur as I did on Deutsche Welle. Well, that led to my censorship on Deutsche Welle, and so on. But if at some point we start to compromise to adjust our discourse, then yes, go ahead and shoot us down for being inconsistent, for selling out, for being unreliable. But on our part, that's it.
Pero de nuestra parte eso. Y por otro lado, no solo queremos establecer.
And on the other hand, we don't just want to establish dialogue, communication, and debate with people who think like us, but also with people who have opposing or different ideas. Whether Pedro Baños has different ideas or not, honestly, I don't follow his broadcasts every day. Regarding Ukraine and global geopolitics, he takes a critical stance, based on the little I've seen here and there and in interviews. When we've done interviews here with him, or he with us, that's the impression I get. And if not, well, that's up to him in any case. But we present our own stance. We should also be careful not to fall into this dynamic so typical of social media, wanting to generate communication, interaction, and relationships only with comfortable narratives, with people who think the same way we do.
Los discursos cómodos para nosotros, las personas pensando igual, no. Acá uno debe participar en todos los escenarios.
No. Here one must take part in every setting, in all of them. The friendly ones, the unfriendly ones, the close ones, and the distant ones. And if you can take part in the unfriendly and distant ones, with the chance to have a critical voice there, even better, even better, even better. In our case, we always take part with a critical but respectful voice. In all my debates, I always present arguments, not insults, for now. If at some point someone has insulted, well, they'll be answered in kind. But anyway, thanks for the warning. And again, Andres 15, it's not what it seems. He throws the stone and hides his hand.
Andrés 15 no es lo que parece, tira la piedra y esconde la mano. Bueno, ok, tomado el consejo. Gracias.
All right, okay, advice taken. Thank you. Well, Demolishers, tomorrow we'll be here with Fernando Moragon. On Monday, the first show by Juan Antonio Aguilar here on Demolishing Myths. You'll remember his previous show on DMP Geopolitics. For now, DMP Geopolitics has no live programming. And his show will be here on Monday, and on Tuesday, Fernando Moragon again. But tomorrow, we'll be here with Fernando for our Sunday talks. As always, it's a pleasure and a joy to have you with us. To Beatriz Pulido, our usual kiss and hug. Demolishers, we love you very much. A kiss, a hug, and see you tomorrow. Bye.
Los queremos mucho. Un beso, un abrazo y hasta mañana. Chao.